Victoria Cross's studio resembled an abandoned temple to a dead god. Tall windows of the historic brownstone in Brooklyn's industrial quarter let in harsh February light that turned the dust in the air into a shimmering haze. The smell of linseed oil mixed with turpentine and stale air, creating a suffocating atmosphere of creative chaos that persisted even after its creator's death. Ancient radiators barely heated the space, and cold seeped through brick walls, settling into bones. Helen Cross stood in the middle of this chaos, wearing sterile nitrile gloves, like a surgeon preparing for an autopsy. Her slender frame in a charcoal sweater and tailored slacks seemed foreign in this riot of color and disorder. Gray-blue eyes methodically scanned the space with the trained professional gaze of someone accustomed to spotting the smallest cracks and inconsistencies. Every object in the studio, from dried paint tubes to stained canvases stacked against walls, was part of the archaeology of her mother's madness, which Helen had spent decades trying to ignore. She moved carefully, deliberately, picked up a tube of cadmium red, checked the date, recorded it in her notebook with calligraphic precision, packed it into a box clearly labeled Pigments, Cadmium Group. This wasn't cleaning. This was a purification ritual, a desperate attempt to impose her world of logic onto Victoria's all-consuming essence, which filled every space, even in death. Each brush with dried bristles, each palette with fossilized paint remnants was catalogued and given a place in the system. Order, control, predictability. Victoria never understood this. For her, chaos was the source of inspiration, and Helen was the strange, unnaturally quiet child who organized her tiny corner while creative storms raged around her. "You're too serious, sweetheart," her mother would say, laughing that rolling laugh of hers. "You're restoring a world that isn't broken." Helen swallowed, pushing away the memory. 3 days had passed since the funeral. 3 days she'd spent in her apartment, sitting in absolute silence, trying to comprehend that Victoria was gone. Car accident, the police said. Wet road, poor visibility. Instant death. Helen accepted this information with the same mechanical calm with which she accepted any news about her mother. She didn't cry. Tears seemed like a chaotic reaction, a loss of control. But now, standing in the heart of her mother's world, she felt the studio walls pressing in on her, filling her lungs with the thick air of the past. She wiped her finger along the edge of a shelf, removing non-existent dust. Tick, a nervous habit she could never conquer. Her gaze caught on the far shelf, lined with glass jars of pigments. Victoria preferred working with old techniques, mixing paints by hand from natural materials. A heavy jar labeled vermilion sat not quite straight, tilted slightly forward. Helen froze. Dust. The dust around the jar was disturbed. The thin layer that covered every object in the studio with an even gray shroud had a clear boundary here, as if someone had recently picked up the jar and set it back down. Helen approached closer, her heart beating faster. She lifted the jar from the shelf, weighing it in her palms. Discrepancy. The weight didn't match the volume. The jar was too light for the amount of pigment that should be inside. Helen held it up to the window, turning it in the light. Her professional eye, capable of distinguishing the finest layers of varnish on 16th century paintings, instantly noticed the anomaly. A hairline, almost invisible seam along the base's contour. This wasn't a factory detail. This was a hiding place, created with craftsmanship worthy of Victoria herself. Helen's hands trembled as she carefully set the jar on the work table. She retrieved from her bag a folding case of tools, tiny scalpels she used for restoration. Selecting the thinnest, she carefully pried at the seam. A quiet, barely audible click. The false bottom separated. Inside lay a notebook. Thick, bound in black leather, it filled the entire space of the compartment. Helen extracted it with shaking fingers, unconsciously smoothing a non-existent wrinkle in her sweater. She expected to find sketches, her mother's creative struggles, poetry by Dickinson or Plath that Victoria loved to recite at her noisy parties. The myth of the suffering artist, the misunderstood genius. Instead, opening the first page, she saw dates and numbers. The handwriting was impeccably even, calligraphic. Not creative bursts, but methodical records. A ledger. Helen turned the page, and another. March 15th, 2018. Van Gogh, Poppies. Buyer, Japanese banker Yamamoto, $2, 3 million. Original stays with S, copy to client. Net profit, $780,000. The words blurred before her eyes. Helen blinked, reread. Her brain refused to process the information, as if encountering an impossible chemical compound. She turned several more pages. June 22nd, 2019. Vermeer, girl with a flute. Client, private collection Dubai. $1.8 million. This money will pay for Helen's scholarship at Pratt. S is pleased. Scholarship. Helen exhaled sharply, as if taking a blow to the solar plexus. Her education. Pratt Institute in New York, the prestigious institution where she'd spent the best years of her life studying restoration, pigment chemistry, art history. She'd been proud of getting in on her own, through her own work. Victoria never talked about money, and Helen, naively, blindly, accepted that silence as maternal discretion. Cold spread through her veins like poison injected straight into the heart. August 10th, 2020. Klaas, still life with oysters. $950,000. Sold to Swiss collector through S. This money will send Helen to summer restoration program in Florence. Summer program. Florence. The brightest memory of her youth. 2 weeks spent in the Uffizi workshops, studying the techniques of old masters, breathing in the smell of history and art. She remembered returning home, overwhelmed with joy, and Victoria hugging her, saying, "See, sweetheart, the world is beautiful when you let it be beautiful." Lies. All of it was lies. Helen flipped through the diary, her breathing becoming shallow, irregular. Page after page revealed the system. Names of artists she worshipped turned into commodity listings. Van Gogh, Vermeer, Rembrandt, Monet. Originals stayed with the mysterious S. Copies went to unsuspecting buyers. Victoria wasn't an artist. She was a forger of genius-level skill, working for an organization that turned art into currency for money laundering. Each entry about Helen delivered a new blow. University, apartment, laboratory equipment. Her life, her career, her pride, everything was built on a foundation of stolen and counterfeit. Other people's pain, deceived collectors, museums stripped of originals. Helen's hands gripped the notebook's edges so hard her knuckles went white. She wanted to hurl the diary at the wall, tear it apart, burn it. Destroy this truth, return to her safe world of illusions. But professional instinct proved stronger. She kept reading. The last entry took up just 3 lines. The handwriting here differed from previous pages, uneven, hurried, as if written in haste or under the influence of strong emotions. They suspect something. All my insurance is in golden shimmer. It's the key to everything. Helen stopped, reread. The word "they" echoed in the studio's silence, materializing into invisible threat. Golden shimmer. She remembered that painting. A small landscape that had hung in Victoria's bedroom, unremarkable. Her mother's own work, as she'd said. A study of light on water. The accidental car crash instantly stopped being accidental. Helen's heart beat with painful, irregular frequency. Wet road, poor visibility. Police found no witnesses. The body was cremated quickly per the deceased's wishes, as stated in the will. No autopsy, no questions. Victoria was murdered. And this entry wasn't just the key to the mystery. It was a death sentence that her mother had left her daughter as inheritance. Panic crashed over her in a wave, constricting her throat, making breathing difficult. Helen pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her heart pounding wildly. Her gaze darted around the studio, which had suddenly transformed from a museum of memories into a crime scene. Every shadow seemed like a watcher, every sound outside, footsteps. She needed to call the police immediately. She reached for her phone, but her hand froze halfway. What would she bring them? A diary that could be the ravings of a madwoman? A murder theory without proof? Accusations of a dead mother's crimes, the revelation of which would destroy not only Victoria's memory, but Helen herself? Her career, her reputation as an impeccable restorer, everything would collapse when it came out that she was a forger's daughter. She was completely isolated. Helen slowly lowered her hand. Her breathing evened out. Panic receded, giving way to something colder and sharper. Professional instinct. She looked at the diary not as a frightened daughter, but as a restorer confronting a complex problem. Victoria had left a puzzle. Golden shimmer was the key. She needed to decipher her mother's logic, apply her knowledge, find the answer first. Use it as weapon or shield. Survive. She stood, removed her gloves, folded them methodically, walked to Victoria's bedroom. The painting hung above the bed, 20 by 28 inches, simple wooden frame. Landscape with a lake at sunset, golden shimmer on water. Impressionist technique, nothing remarkable. Helen took it off the wall, turned it over. On the back of the canvas, her mother's signature and date, 2015. She carried the painting to the work table, set it on the easel, turned on the bright lamp, retrieved her magnifying glass, began examining every millimeter of surface. If there was a secret here, she would find it. Insistent pounding on the door made her jump, rough, demanding sound echoing through the studio. Helen froze, clutching the diary. The pounding repeated, louder, more aggressive. She slowly approached the door, looked through the peephole. On the landing stood a large man in a baggy dark suit, wide, colorless face without distinctive features. His posture was relaxed, but carried the patient waiting of a predator. "Who's there?" Helen's voice came out steadier than she expected. "Insurance company. Regarding Victoria Ann Cross. Please open up." The words sounded right, but the intonation was dead, mechanical. Helen felt a prick of alarm at the base of her skull. She opened the door, leaving the chain in place. The man didn't look at her. His colorless eyes scanned the visible part of the studio behind her, methodically studying the space. They stopped on canvases, on the work table, on the easel with golden shimmer. This wasn't the look of an insurance agent. This was the look of someone searching for something specific. "Do you have ID?" Helen asked, not removing the chain. He extended a hand with a worn badge. Helen barely glimpsed the photo and seal before he pulled it back. Too fast. Too careless. "I need to ask some questions about the deceased's property. Standard procedure." Lies. Every word was a lie. So clumsy and obvious it was more frightening than any direct threat. He wasn't even trying to sound convincing. The studio had transformed from refuge to cage. Helen started closing the door. "Sorry, call ahead and schedule an appointment. Today isn't convenient." His hand shot forward, blocking the door. The force of impact stretched the chain to its limit. "Give me the book." 2 words, flat, emotionless. They erased all doubt, all remaining hope of mistake. He knew about the diary. He came with purpose. Helen understood he wouldn't leave without what he came for, and that her life in this moment meant absolutely nothing to him. She yanked the door toward herself with all her strength, trying to dislodge his arm. The chain tore from its housing with a crack. The door flew open. The enforcer crossed the threshold with the inevitability of an avalanche. Helen retreated deeper into the studio, instinctively pressing the diary to her chest. It was pointless. He was twice her size, physically superior in every way. But giving up the diary meant surrendering her only lead, her only chance to understand what was happening. "No," she breathed. He didn't respond, just lunged forward sharply. His hand closed around her wrist like a steel trap. The pain was sharp, humiliating. Fingers dug into bone with such force that Helen cried out. She jerked, trying to break free, but his grip was dead, absolute. In that moment, she understood. Everything she took pride in, intellect, knowledge, years of training, was useless. She was just a weak physical body interfering with his orders, an object that needed breaking. Her free hand desperately groped across the work table, colliding with familiar objects, brushes, paint tubes, palette, and a heavy glass jar. Turpentine. Caustic, pungent liquid she used daily for cleaning brushes and dissolving old varnish. Animal instinct kicked in before conscious thought. Helen grabbed the jar and, with strength she didn't know she possessed, splashed the contents directly into the enforcer's face. Liquid hit his eyes, nose, mouth. The reaction was instantaneous. He released a guttural, animal roar, released her wrist, clutched his face with both hands. Turpentine burned mucous membranes with chemical cruelty. In blind rage, he swung wildly, knocking Golden Shimmer and several other canvases off the easel. The sound of tearing fabric cut the air. The wooden frame cracked with a dry snap. Backing toward the door, gasping with pain, he rasped through clenched teeth. "I'll come back for you, piece of trash. You're dead." The door slammed, sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. Helen stood in the middle of the wreckage, clutching the diary so hard her fingers went numb. Her heart pounded in her throat. The smell of turpentine mixed with the smell of fear. Her own sweat, adrenaline, terror. The threat had stopped being abstract. Now it had a face, a voice, and a promise to return. A quiet, delicate knock at the door sounded so unreal after the recent violence that Helen flinched as if from a gunshot. The contrast was surreal. She approached the peephole on unsteady legs. On the threshold stood an elegant, silver-haired man in an expensive cashmere coat. In his hands, a bouquet of white lilies. His face expressed what seemed like genuine sympathy. Sebastian Archer, Victoria's old friend, art consultant, as he called himself. Helen had met him at her mother's gallery openings several times. Polite, cultured, slightly detached. She opened the door. Sebastian took her in with a glance. Disheveled hair, trembling hands, wreckage in the studio, and his face contorted with an expression of deep concern. "Helen, I heard the terrible news." His voice was velvet, soothing. "I'm here to help. Victoria was my dear friend. I couldn't not come." But his eyes, brown, almost black eyes, didn't linger on Helen's face. They quickly, almost imperceptibly, assessed the scene. Overturned canvases, puddle of turpentine on the floor, broken easel. Helen's trembling hands clutching something behind her back. And in that moment, an icy wave of understanding crashed over Helen, washing away the remnants of adrenaline and fear. The enforcer was a tool, blunt force, an axe. And standing before her was the architect, the surgeon, the brain of the operation. The real monster had just entered her home with a bouquet of flowers for the deceased. Sebastian took over Victoria's studio with the invisibility of an experienced strategist. There were no loud declarations, no demands. He simply started appearing. Every morning, every evening. His presence transformed from a visit into a permanent constant, as if he were part of the building's architecture itself. The third day began with a quiet knock at the door. Helen opened it, knowing who she'd see. Sebastian stood on the threshold with a white pastry box and 2 coffee cups. The smell of fresh baking burst into the studio, inappropriately domestic among the smells of paint and turpentine. "Good morning, Helen. Hope you don't mind." His smile was warm, almost paternal. "Thought you needed to eat properly. Stress devours strength." He entered without waiting for an answer. Settled at Victoria's work table with the ease of a homeowner. Retrieved croissants, arranged cups, laid out napkins. Every gesture was deliberate, careful. Helen stood by the door, watching her space cease being her own. "Sit, please. You need strength for sorting through your mother's estate." She sat, took a croissant, bit into it. Flaky pastry melted on her tongue, buttery and perfect. This was from that bakery on Madison Avenue where Helen sometimes stopped, looking at the display but never buying. Too expensive for her budget. Sebastian remembered, or found out. "I spoke with my attorney," he said between sips of coffee. "Estate processing might drag on. Bureaucracy, you understand. But don't worry. I'll help expedite the process." Every word was care. Every action, assistance. But Helen felt golden cage bars closing around her. He controlled her schedule, answered phone calls for her. "Helen's having a hard time talking right now. I'll pass along the message." Shielded her from unnecessary visitors. The studio was becoming an isolated island where Sebastian was the only bridge to the outside world. In the evening, he brought dinner. Containers from a restaurant Helen had only seen in lifestyle magazines. Risotto with porcini mushrooms, the tenderest duck, dessert with gold flakes. They ate at the table surrounded by Victoria's unfinished paintings. Sebastian told stories about his friendship with her mother, light, witty anecdotes painting a portrait of a bohemian artist. Not a word about the diary. Not a hint that he was searching for something specific. But his eyes. Brown, almost black, they never stopped assessing. When Helen flinched at a sharp sound from the street, he noticed. When she unconsciously wiped the table's edge, he registered it. Every reaction was catalogued, analyzed, transformed into data for his invisible calculations. On the 4th evening, he poured himself cognac from a bottle brought the day before. Amber liquid swirled in the crystal glass, casting warm reflections on the walls. Sebastian took a small sip, meditatively rolled the drink in his mouth before swallowing. "By the way," he said with the casualness of someone remembering an insignificant detail, "I met with an old friend today. He works in the police department. Told him about that incident with, what did you call him? The insurance employee?" Helen froze, holding her cup of cold tea. "My friend compiled a sketch based on neighbors' descriptions," Sebastian continued, examining his glass in the light. "Interesting type. Colorless, forgettable. People like that, Helen, are like ghosts, almost impossible to find." A pause hung in the air, heavy and sticky. "But what's worse?" Sebastian's voice became quieter, almost confidential. "They're very easy to hire again, especially if the client feels the job isn't finished. You understand what I'm saying?" He looked at her directly. The smile remained warm, paternal, but the words cut more precisely than a scalpel. "Good thing I'm here," he added, taking another sip. "While I'm around, you're safe. No one will dare bother you." Helen nodded. Her fingers gripped the cup's edge so hard her knuckles went white. She understood the message. Sebastian was the only thing standing between her and the enforcer's return. He was protector. He was jailer. He was both roles simultaneously. At night, when Sebastian finally left, he always left late, around midnight, with a promise to return in the morning. Helen allowed herself to drop the mask. Her face, frozen in the expression of a grateful, frightened daughter, relaxed. Jaw muscles ached from constant tension. She sat on the studio floor, leaning against the cold wall, methodically dissecting the day. Every word Sebastian said, every gesture. She'd learned to play the role, cry at the right moments, flinch at loud sounds, let him hold her hand when he comforted her, talking about Victoria's death. Grief became her camouflage, weakness, her weapon. But inside, icy hatred grew, cold and crystalline clear, like chemical reagents in her laboratory. She fed this hatred, nurtured it, transformed it into fuel for her performance. Each evening, alone, she gave herself 15 minutes to be herself. Clench her fists, grind her teeth, curse Victoria, Sebastian, her own naivety, and then returned to the diary. The pages became painfully familiar, each entry, each figure imprinted in memory with photographic precision. But on the sixth night, when Helen was once again flipping through the notebook, her gaze caught on an anomaly. Page 112. Entry from March 2022. Victoria's handwriting, even and calligraphic. But the paper. Helen brought the page closer to the desk lamp. The sheet's surface was uneven, slightly deformed, as if someone had written on the previous page, pressing too hard, and the pen left an indented trace. But the previous page wasn't there. It had been torn out, carefully, right at the binding. Helen's pulse quickened. This was a classic mistake. Even such a master of deception as Victoria could miss a detail. Indented traces, phantom writing that a professional could restore. Helen stood, approached her bag, retrieved her case of tools. Her hands moved with surgical precision, perfected by years of restoration. She positioned the desk lamp at a sharp angle to the page. Light fell obliquely, transforming the slightest irregularities into relief. And letters emerged. Ghostly, barely distinguishable, but readable. Helen took a soft graphite pencil, began carefully, barely touching the paper, shading the surface. A forensic technique she used when attributing signatures on old paintings. Graphite settled on raised areas, ignoring the indented traces. Letters and numbers materialized on the page like a developing photograph. CH-7834-2156-9047-3382. Below, an alphanumeric code. GLD-SHM-2025-VC. Helen set down the pencil, stared at the result. This was a bank account number. The structure was unmistakable. Swiss Bank IBAN format. The code beneath could be an access password. Bitter triumph spread through her chest, mixing with revulsion. Here it was, the solution. Golden Shimmer wasn't a work of art. It was a cynical code name for access to dirty money. GLD-SHM, abbreviation for Golden Shimmer. Victoria hadn't left her daughter an artist's legacy. She'd left instructions for accessing stolen capital. Helen closed the diary, stood, walked to the window. February Brooklyn stretched before her in darkness, lights from scattered windows flickering in old buildings. Somewhere out there, in one of those buildings, Sebastian was planning his next move. And she, hers. But something nagged at her. Professional intuition, A restorer's instinct trained for years not to trust the obvious. If golden shimmer was just a cover, why would Victoria spend time creating a real painting? A cheap fake bought at a souvenir shop would have served the same function. Helen approached the easel where that very painting stood. Landscape with a lake, golden shimmer of sunset on water. She turned on the bright lamp, retrieved her magnifying glass, began examining the surface. The ground was complex, multi-layered. The paint application technique revealed a professional hand, and the craquure, a network of the finest cracks in the paint layer, had a character impossible to fake artificially. This was the result of natural aging. The painting was genuine, or a very, very high-quality imitation. Helen needed a laboratory. X-ray fluorescence analysis could determine pigment composition. Infrared reflectography could reveal the underdrawing. Only professional equipment provided absolute certainty. The decision crystallized instantly. The risk was enormous. But remaining in ignorance meant surrendering control of the game to Sebastian, and control was the one thing Helen couldn't afford to lose. The next evening, she lied to Sebastian for the first time. The lie slipped from her tongue surprisingly easily, polished by days of acting. "I need to stay at a friend's place tonight. Here, too many memories. I'm suffocating." Sebastian studied her face. His gaze was an X-ray, trying to see right through. Helen allowed her eyes to fill with tears. Old trick. Think about her father's death, that moment when the doctor came out of the ICU and shook his head. The tears came real. "Of course, Helen. You need a break." He embraced her shoulders, paternally, gently. "Call me when you get back. Anytime. I'll come." She nodded into his chest, smelling his expensive cologne with notes of sandalwood. The museum greeted her with silence. 11 at night, guards changing shifts, and Helen, using her staff badge, slipped through the service entrance. The laboratory was located in the basement, where city noise didn't reach. This was her sanctuary, a place where she controlled every molecule of air. She carefully positioned golden shimmer on the work table, turned on the X-ray fluorescence analyzer. The device hummed, beginning to warm up. Helen was adjusting parameters when a loud click sounded. The lights went out. Absolute darkness crashed down on the laboratory, so complete and dense that Helen momentarily lost spatial orientation. She froze, listening. The humming of instruments died. Only silence, torn by her own heartbeat. And then she heard it. A quiet, metallic sound. The turn of a key in the entrance door lock. Someone had locked her inside. Footsteps, heavy, measured, confident. They walked down the corridor, approaching the laboratory. Helen recognized that sound. The enforcer. He'd returned. She silently removed her shoes. Bare feet slid across cold linoleum. Every inch of this laboratory was imprinted in her memory. 6 steps to the reagent shelving. Turn left. 3 steps to the work table with microscopes. The laboratory door opened. A massive figure filled the doorway, a dark silhouette against barely distinguishable light from the corridor. The enforcer stepped inside. The door behind him closed with a soft click. The hunt had begun. Helen heard his breathing. Heavy, controlled. He moved carefully, listening. She pressed against the shelving, feeling cold glass flasks behind her back. Counted his steps. 1, 2, 3. He was approaching the work table where she'd left the painting. She needed to create a distraction. Helen felt for the edge of a stand with flasks, pushed with all her strength. The crash of breaking glass exploded in the silence. Flasks of chemicals fell to the floor, liquids spreading, mixing. The acrid smell of ammonia and acetone filled the air. The enforcer coughed, spun sharply toward the sound. Helen slipped in the opposite direction, circled the shelving, moved toward the door. 10 more steps to salvation. His hand shot from the darkness, grabbing her wrist. The grip was steel. Helen jerked, but he was stronger, pulled her toward himself with the inexorable force of a winch. His breath scorched her face. Smell of sweat and tobacco. Desperation brought clarity. Helen's right hand frantically groped along the nearby table. Fingers collided with a familiar shape. UV lamp. A powerful device for detecting later alterations on paintings. She found the switch. Pressed it. Purple light exploded in the darkness. Cold, otherworldly radiance burning the retina. For eyes accustomed to complete darkness, this was like staring directly at the sun. The enforcer roared, hurled Helen away, covering his eyes with his hands. Blind, disoriented, dangerous in his rage. Helen didn't waste time. Bolted for the emergency door. Her fingers found the bolt, yanked. The door flew open. Cold night air struck her face. She ran outside without looking back. The service exit led to a narrow alley between buildings. Helen ran barefoot on wet pavement, shoes left in the laboratory along with golden shimmer. Cold penetrated through her thin sweater. Lungs burned. But she ran until she burst onto a lit street, and then she saw him. A black sedan sat at the curb, engine running, headlights extinguished. The door opened, and Sebastian emerged from the car. His face expressed deep concern, perfectly calibrated. "Helen!" He stepped toward her, opening his arms. "My God, what happened? I sensed something was wrong, decided to check. For your safety." His voice was velvet, soothing. Lies flowed as naturally as truth. Helen stood, trembling from cold and adrenaline. Salvation proved an illusion. She'd run from one cage straight into another. Sebastian approached closer, removed his cashmere coat, draped it over her shoulders. Heavy, warm, smelling of his cologne. Adjusted the collar with a caring gesture. And then Helen saw it. Dim streetlight fell on his hand, impeccably white shirt cuff, and on it, a tiny but irrefutable stain. Bright blue, cobalt blue. A rare and expensive pigment she used in restoration. The jar of that pigment had been knocked over in Victoria's studio. During the enforcer's first attack, blue paint had spilled across the floor, across canvases, across the attacker's clothing. The world narrowed to that stain. It screamed, accused, exposed. Sebastian didn't just know about the enforcer. He'd been there, or contacted him immediately after. He was the employer, the conductor, the architect of the entire nightmare. "Helen, you're freezing. Get in the car. I'll take you home." Helen raised her eyes to his face. Warm smile, paternal care. Perfect mask, beneath which a predator hid. She said nothing, just nodded. Got in the car. The coat enveloped her like a shroud. The door closed with a soft click. But inside Helen, a tectonic shift occurred. Fear retreated. Panic evaporated. Only cold, crystalline hatred remained, and absolute clarity. She was no longer a victim playing the role of frightened girl. She was an opponent who had just identified her true enemy. The interior of Sebastian's car smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Helen sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on darkness beyond the window. But inside, in that part of consciousness she'd learned to hide from others' eyes, furious work was happening. The blue stain on Sebastian's cuff burned in her memory like a brand. Irrefutable proof. He didn't just know about the attacks. He orchestrated them, conducted them, controlled every step of this nightmare, remaining in shadow under the mask of caring family friend. The hatred inside her was cold, Not blind fury, but crystalline clear, like reagents in her laboratory. And precisely this clarity suggested her solution. Sebastian thought her frightened, broken pawn, saw in her a weak girl playing a big game. And in this delusion lay his vulnerability. Helen decided to use this blindness. She would play the role to the end, but now this would be her performance. Her script. The false key from the diary, the bank account number and code, would become her bait. She would gift Sebastian a simple, greedy solution. Force him to believe his primitive intimidation tactics had defeated her intellect. And buy time. Time to find the real truth hidden in golden shimmer. Helen, Sebastian's voice interrupted her thoughts. Soft, soothing. You're trembling. Are you cold? She shook her head, not turning. Let him see her profile, tired, defeated. The mask proved easier than she expected. 10 days of acting had taught her to control every facial muscle. Just tired, she whispered. Of course. He covered her hand with his, warm, confident. Soon everything will be over. Helen didn't respond. Words stuck in her throat, bitter and poisonous. But she nodded. Let his palm remain on her hand for the rest of the drive. The next morning she met with red, swollen eyes. Sleep hadn't come. She'd spent the night sitting on the studio's cold floor, methodically rehearsing every detail of her performance, every word, every gesture, every pause. When Sebastian appeared with the usual croissants and coffee, Helen presented herself as the living embodiment of defeat. Clothing wrinkled, she'd deliberately slept in it. Hair disheveled, strands escaped from her ponytail. Hands trembled when she took the cup, and this wasn't acting. Adrenaline and sleeplessness did their work. Sebastian. Her voice broke on the first syllable. She cleared her throat, began again. I need to talk to you. He set down his coffee. Full attention. Predator's gaze, scenting prey. Of course. About anything. Helen lowered her eyes, stared into her cup. Fingers gripped the ceramic so hard her knuckles went white. I found... A breath, halting, gasping. Going through my mother's things. An old book, Dickinson poems. And there, tucked between pages. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Her hand trembled, partly from acting, partly from real anxiety. The plan was risky. If Sebastian recognized the deception, I don't understand what this is, but there are numbers, and some code. I thought... She raised eyes full of despair to him. I thought this might be what they're looking for. Those people. The cartel. Sebastian took the paper. His face remained absolutely neutral while he studied what was written. Account number. Access code. Seconds stretched like hours, and then Helen saw it. A barely noticeable change in the corners of his mouth. Not a smile. Something more primitive. Predatory satisfaction. Smart girl, he said, carefully folding the paper. You did everything right, coming to me. Your mother would be proud of your pragmatism. The mention of Victoria burned like acid on skin. Helen squeezed her eyes shut, portraying pain. But inside another emotion grew. Hope. Dangerous. Intoxicating. He believed it. Swallowed the bait. Does this mean they'll leave me alone? Her voice trembled. Can I leave? Go back to the city? Sebastian stood, walked to the window. His silhouette darkened against gray Brooklyn light. Almost, he said without turning. One last formality remains. Cold crept up Helen's spine. Something in his tone had changed, become harder. What formality? She rose from the chair, instinctively retreating. Sebastian turned. His smile lost its last remnants of warmth, transformed into a snarl covered by politeness. I need to contact certain people, confirm the information, make sure the account is active and access works. He pulled out his phone, checked the screen. For this, we'll need to go to a secure location. Just a precaution, you understand. Hope shattered, sharp fragments piercing her chest. Helen understood. They wouldn't release her. The bluff hadn't given her freedom. It had merely become justification for her abduction. I don't want to go anywhere, she whispered, voice breaking with genuine fear. Acting and reality merged. Call from here, please. I'm afraid that's impossible. Sebastian stepped toward her. His hand landed on her shoulder, firm, possessive. Don't be afraid. I'll be with you. Protect you. Protector. Jailer. Executioner. The interior of his car became a hermetically sealed capsule. The door closed with a quiet, expensive click. Locks automatically engaged. Sebastian started the engine, and the vehicle moved smoothly forward. Helen sat in the back seat, wedged between soft leather and cold glass. Outside the window, Brooklyn slowly transformed. Elegant facades of the historic district gave way to drab housing projects. Then, even those disappeared, yielding to industrial landscapes. Rusting skeletons of factories, concrete fences festooned with barbed wire, vacant lots overgrown with weeds. Each mile removed her from civilization, from people, from hope. Helen tried to memorize the route, turns, forks, landmarks, but the industrial zone was monotonous, identical in all directions. Gray, faceless wasteland where one could disappear and no one would notice. Her brain feverishly searched for escape routes. Throw herself from the car? Speed too high. Try to grab Sebastian's phone, call police. He was twice her size and stronger. Scream when they arrived? Who would hear in this desolation? The naivety of her plan became obvious. Sebastian never intended to release her. He simply waited for her to give him something. Truth or lies didn't matter. Something he could present to his employers as work product before... Helen cut off that thought. Panic didn't help. She clenched her teeth, focused on breathing. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. The car turned onto a broken asphalt road. Ahead appeared massive contours of an abandoned building. Port Warehouse. Enormous, dilapidated, with broken windows and sagging roof. Sebastian parked by a heavy metal door. Got out, walked around the car, opened Helen's door. Extended his hand, helping her exit. Gentlemen to the end. The air smelled of rust, dampness, and nearby water. Cold wind from the harbor penetrated through everything. Helen wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Sebastian gently pushed her toward the entrance. The metal door opened with a prolonged screech. Beyond it, darkness, diluted by dim light filtering through dirty windows near the ceiling. The warehouse was huge, empty, echoing. Helen crossed the threshold. Sebastian entered behind her. The door slammed shut with a crash, echoing through the space. Sound of finality, of sentence. "Welcome," Sebastian said. His voice had lost its velvet quality, became flat, businesslike. "Make yourself comfortable. We'll have to wait." Helen looked around. Piles of garbage in corners, broken crates, rusted barrels, columns of dust in dim light. Perfect place to disappear forever. From the darkest part of the warehouse came heavy footsteps. A figure materialized from shadows. The enforcer. He walked slowly, steadily, his face remaining as colorless and empty as at their first meeting. Sebastian turned to him, nodded. She gave us the account, he said, as if Helen weren't there, as if she were an object, not a person. But Victoria was a lying witch. Make sure the girl isn't hiding anything. Check her belongings. No more surprises. The order sounded with cold indifference. The last remnants of civilized mask fell from Sebastian. Standing before Helen wasn't an art consultant, not a family friend. Before her stood a professional criminal giving commands to his tool. The enforcer stepped toward her, and in that moment, something broke inside Helen. Didn't crumble, broke. Sharply, with a crack, releasing what she'd kept under control her entire life. Survival instinct displaced fear. She was no longer a restorer, not an intellectual, not a girl who feared chaos. She was a cornered animal, and animals fight. When the enforcer extended his hand to grab her, Helen dodged. Her fingers closed around a piece of rusty chain lying on the floor. She swung and struck his extended arm with all her strength. Metal crashed into bone with a dull thud. The enforcer recoiled, more from surprise than pain. His empty eyes widened, the first manifestation of emotion she'd seen on his face. Helen didn't wait, grabbed a fragment of wooden crate and struck his shin with all her force. Wood cracked. The enforcer staggered. "Stop!" Sebastian barked, but Helen wasn't listening. She darted around the warehouse, dodging the enforcer. He was slower than the first time in the studio. Her blows had done their work. But he was relentless, moved with the mechanical persistence of a machine. The struggle was chaotic, dirty. Helen grabbed everything within reach, threw cans, shards, garbage. Most strikes missed or bounced off the enforcer's massive body, but she kept moving, because stopping meant death. And then she saw the door. Small, in the far corner of the warehouse. Ajar. A closet, utility room, something. The enforcer made another lunge. Helen grabbed a rusty barrel and pushed it with all her strength. Metal rumbled across concrete floor, crashed into the enforcer's legs. He stumbled, momentarily losing balance. That moment was enough. Helen bolted for the door, burst inside the closet, slammed the flimsy wooden door behind her, and threw her entire body against it while her trembling fingers searched for the bolt. Rusty metal screeched into the slot. Outside, a blow thundered. The door shuddered. Another blow. Splinters flew inward. Helen jumped back, pressed against the opposite wall. The closet was tiny. Empty. No exit. Only solid concrete walls and a door that would shatter in minutes. A trap inside a trap. Helen frantically searched her pockets. Phone. Sebastian had taken it in the car. Keys. Useless. Notebook. Pen. And the folding case of tools. She opened it with trembling hands. Scalpels. Brushes. Magnifying glass. And the UV lamp. Compact but powerful. She'd instinctively grabbed it from the studio. Blows on the door continued, methodical, inexorable. Wood cracked, sagged. In the corner of the closet, leaning against the wall, stood a canvas. Golden shimmer. Helen had grabbed it in the last moment of flight from the studio, on autopilot without thinking. Professional instinct. Don't leave the research object. The door cracked down the middle. Through the gap, the enforcer's massive hand reached in, searching for the bolt. Helen turned on the UV lamp, just to see, just to control something in this chaos. Cold purple light flooded the closet, and accidentally fell on the canvas in her hands. The unremarkable landscape disappeared. Beneath it, as if emerging from another dimension, a portrait glowed. A male face, rendered with incredible detail. Every wrinkle, every hair of the beard. Deep, penetrating eyes looking directly at the viewer. Characteristic hatching. Perfect sfumato technique. And in the lower right corner, A monogram. A D. Albrecht Dürer. The world stopped. Helen forgot about breathing, about the door breaking apart behind her, about the enforcer, about Sebastian, about death. She stared at the masterpiece hidden under layers of ordinary paint, at a work of art worth tens of millions. All this time she'd been searching for money, bank accounts, a cynical financial scheme, and she'd found immortality. The door flew off its hinges with a deafening crash. The enforcer burst inside, breathing heavily. Behind him entered Sebastian, his face absolutely calm. Helen jumped to her feet, raised the painting, illuminated by the UV lamp. Dürer's portrait glowed in purple light like a holy revelation.
"You were looking for money!"
Her voice broke into a scream, a mixture of hysteria and desperate triumph.
"Idiots! You were looking for bank accounts, and all this time you had this right under your noses!"
She expected shock, confusion, admission of defeat. But Sebastian merely looked at the portrait and laughed. Quietly, gutturally, without the slightest mirth. The laugh of someone appreciating another's naivety. "You think we didn't know?" He shook his head like a disappointed teacher. "Foolish, naive girl." He pulled his phone from his pocket. Several finger movements across the screen turned the phone toward Helen. On the screen, a photograph. Street cafe, bright sun, palm trees in background, terrace overlooking the ocean. And at the table, in sunglasses, coffee cup in hand, Victoria. She was smiling, relaxed, happy, squinting from the sun, looked 10 years younger than Helen remembered. The date on the photograph, 3 days ago. The world collapsed. Didn't crack, didn't sway, collapsed instantly, like a building in an explosion, turning to dust and debris. "Rio de Janeiro," Sebastian said, putting away the phone. "She's in Rio now, with all the cartel's money. Brilliant plan, have to admit. Stage her death, leave a diary with false leads, plant Dürer's masterpiece as bait to distract us while she escapes. And the most brilliant part." He leaned closer. His voice became almost tender. "The most brilliant part? Using her own daughter as bait. You weren't the heir, Helen. You were the sacrificial lamb. A pawn your loving mother deliberately threw to the wolves to buy herself time to escape." Helen stood motionless. Dürer's portrait slipped from weakened fingers, fell to the floor. The UV lamp went dark from impact. In the gathering darkness, she heard only her own breathing, raspy, broken, like a wounded animal's. Victoria wasn't a victim. She was the architect. And Helen, not daughter, not heir, not keeper of secrets, just bait. Expendable material in a brilliant, monstrous plan. And the game had reached an entirely new level. The photograph on the phone screen burned brighter than any ultraviolet light. Helen stared at Victoria's smiling face, relaxed, happy, alive. And reality crumbled to dust. The sound of dripping water somewhere in the warehouse corner became thunder. Each drop fell on her consciousness like a hammer driving nails into a coffin lid. Not her coffin. The coffin of illusions in which she'd buried her life. The funeral was farce. Tears, unnecessary sacrifice. The struggle, part of someone else's script, written by hands of a woman squinting from sun on a Rio terrace, sipping coffee bought with cartel money. The pain of betrayal proved sharper than fear of a gun, physically sharper. Helen felt it in her chest, as if a knife had entered between ribs and slowly twisted. Victoria hadn't just abandoned her. She'd carefully, methodically constructed this death trap, using her own daughter as bait for wolves. "I understand this is difficult," Sebastian said, returning the phone to his jacket's inner pocket. His voice lost its last notes of human warmth. but I hope you appreciate the plan's elegance. Your mother was a genius." He brushed non-existent dust from his sleeve. The gesture was so mundane, so everyday, as if they were discussing weather, not betrayal. "My task was never finding Victoria's money," he continued, circling the closet with slow, measured steps. "The money vanished. She won that round. I was hired for something else. Cleanup." He stopped at the wall, ran his finger along the dirty concrete surface, like an inspector checking cleaning quality. "The syndicate doesn't tolerate loose ends." Victoria left threads. The diary. The studio. A daughter who might start asking questions. His brown eyes slid across Helen's face with cold indifference. "These are risks. I eliminate risks." The enforcer stood silently at the closet exit, blocking the only path to salvation. His colorless eyes expressed nothing, just registered the scene. "The Dürer painting," Sebastian nodded at the canvas lying on the floor, "is insulting, laughable compensation for stolen millions. But at least something." He sighed, as if regretting low wages. "And you, Helen?" A pause hung in the air. "You're the last living evidence. A witness who now knows too much about Victoria's methods, about connections, about the system." His words held no malice, only cold, businesslike logic. "You understand my position?" Helen didn't respond. Her breathing became shallow, irregular. She leaned against the wall, her legs turned to cotton. Sebastian drew a pistol from his waistband. The movement was smooth, unhurried. The suppressor on the barrel looked unnaturally long, transforming the weapon into an ugly, functional construction. "Victoria was a genius," he said, with a note of professional admiration. "The scale of deception is impressive. Stage death, escape with money, leave the perfect bait in the form of a daughter who'll distract us while she dissolves into South America." He shook his head. "Brilliant plan. But even geniuses leave garbage behind." The pistol rose, the black opening of the suppressor looking at Helen like a bottomless well. "Unfortunately, Helen, you're that very garbage I was hired to clean up." His face remained absolutely neutral. This wasn't an execution. This was the final item on a to-do list, the last stroke in completing the work. Helen stared into the gun barrel, and her gaze unfocused. Behind Sebastian's shoulder, on the closet floor, in the ghostly purple reflection of the broken UV lamp, the portrait still glowed. Damaged, but recognizable. A 16th century male face looking into eternity from canvas. A masterpiece, priceless, unique. And in that moment, at the very bottom of despair, something clicked in her brain. She saw not art. She saw the only thing in this dirty, cursed place that had real value to Sebastian. Not money, not information, not even her own life. Beauty. Possession of beauty. Victoria had spent her entire life using beauty as a weapon, created it, forged it, sold it, hid it. Manipulated people through their greed for the beautiful. And Helen, daughter of a restorer, suddenly understood. She could do the same, but in reverse. The fear in her eyes changed to something new, icy, frightening calm. She slowly shifted her gaze from the portrait to Sebastian's face. "My mother taught me more than how to find beauty," she said quietly. Her voice rang in the warehouse silence like a taut string. "She taught me how to destroy it." This wasn't pleading, not a threat, statement of fact. Sebastian blinked, the first sign of confusion on his face. The pistol wavered, lowered a millimeter. "What are you?" Helen didn't let him finish. With one sharp, animal movement, she launched from her spot. Her hand shot to the rusty shelf where, among the junk, sat a metal canister with a half-erased label, Solvent 646. Fingers closed around cold metal. Don't think. Act. She tore off the lid. Acrid acetone smell hit her nostrils. She swung and splashed the contents directly onto the canvas. Liquid scattered in a fan. Droplets hit Dürer's portrait, the frame, the concrete floor. Solvent struck century-old varnish like acid on flesh. The effect was instantaneous. Paints began bubbling. The face in the portrait distorted, melting, transforming into ugly mass. Hatching blurred. Eyes that had looked through centuries dissolved into shapeless splotches. The masterpiece was dying. And Sebastian roared. The sound tore from his chest, guttural, furious, full of such pain as if the solvent had been thrown at him. Professional mask flew off, exposing something primal. "No, you piece of trash! Stop!" He rushed to the painting, forgot about Helen, about the pistol, about orders. The instinct of an owner watching priceless treasure turn to garbage proved stronger than killer instinct. The pistol fell from his hand, hit the floor with a thud, bounced aside. Sebastian dropped to his knees before the canvas, trying to wipe away caustic liquid with bare hands. Meaningless, desperate, irrational gesture. Solvent had already penetrated the paint layer, destroying bonds that had held 500 years. "No, no, no," he muttered like a prayer. That window was enough for Helen. She tore a heavy red fire extinguisher off the wall. Metal was cold, heavy, real. Adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Sebastian bent over the painting, trying to save the unsalvageable. Helen raised the fire extinguisher overhead. Arm muscles tensed. Into this movement, she channeled all the pain of recent days, all betrayals, all horror, all rage, and brought the steel bottom down on Sebastian's head. The sound was dull, wet, final. Sebastian collapsed to the floor without a single groan. His body went limp. Arms fell helplessly on concrete. Blood began slowly seeping from beneath gray hair, forming a dark puddle. The fire extinguisher fell from Helen's hands, clattered across the floor. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence, broken only by the quiet hiss of solvent continuing its destructive work. Somewhere water dripped. Wind howled through broken warehouse windows. Helen stood, breathing heavily, looked at the scene she'd created. Sebastian's motionless body, the mutilated painting turned into a dirty stain, the pistol lying 3 meters from her. The enforcer. Where was the enforcer? She spun sharply. His massive figure filled the doorway. He stood motionless, observing. His empty eyes shifted from Sebastian's body to Helen, calculating, assessing. Helen froze. Fingers clenched convulsively. Nowhere to run. No weapon. The enforcer took a step forward. Another. And stopped. Bent down, checked the pulse on Sebastian's neck. Straightened. Looked at Helen with a long, assessing gaze. Then turned and unhurriedly exited the closet. His heavy footsteps receded across the warehouse. The metal door opened with a prolonged screech, slammed shut. Silence. Helen sank to the floor, leaned against the wall. Her hands trembled. Her entire body trembled. She hugged her knees, buried her forehead in them, trying to control her breathing. Minutes flowed, becoming eternity. Then she rose, looked at Sebastian one last time. He was breathing, barely noticeable chest movement. Alive. For now. Helen touched nothing. Didn't take the pistol. Didn't retrieve the diary from her bag. Didn't check Sebastian's pockets. She simply left. Stepped over the closet threshold, crossed the warehouse's empty space, pushed the heavy door. Cold February air struck her face. Dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink. Somewhere, seagulls cried. Helen walked barefoot on wet asphalt. Shoes remained in the museum laboratory. That seemed like an event from another life. Cold penetrated through thin clothes, but she didn't notice. The industrial zone was deserted. No cars, no people, only rusty fences and concrete factory boxes. She walked until she reached the waterfront. Less touristy, working part of the city. Gray harbor waves lapped against concrete parapet. On the opposite shore, industrial facilities were visible: cranes, tanks, warehouses. At an old payphone, Helen stopped. Rummaged in her pocket, found several coins. Lifted receiver, dialed police. "Listening?" answered a duty officer's voice. Helen covered her mouth with her palm, altering timbre. "Fight at abandoned port warehouse. Red Hook. Person injured." She named the approximate address, orienting by memory. "Your name?" Helen hung up. This wasn't an act of justice. This was disposal. She wasn't turning in Sebastian. She was simply getting rid of garbage, as he'd planned to get rid of her. She was erasing this chapter, leaving no prints. Walked to the waterfront's edge, sat on a cold concrete step. Watched the water, the rising sun breaking through clouds. Her hands were dirty, rust embedded under nails. Multicolored paint stains from the dyeing painting decorated fingers. Ultramarine, cadmium, ochre. 16th century pigments mixed with 21st century industrial grime. Helen raised her palms to her face, studied them as if seeing them for the first time. A restorer's hands, a beauty killer's hands, a free person's hands. First sun rays touched the water, transforming gray surface into living gold. Shimmer. Golden shimmer on water, like on that very painting where this story began. Helen smiled bitterly. For the first time in her entire life, she was absolutely free. And absolutely alone. Without mother, without illusions, without past. She had nothing. Except the future. She ran dirty fingers along the silver chain on her neck. Father's gift, the only thing remaining from her old life. Unfastened the clasp, held the chain in her palm, feeling the light weight of metal. Then threw it into the harbor. The chain described an arc in the air, sparkled in sunlight, and disappeared into dark water without trace. Helen stood, brushed off dirty pants, fixed disheveled hair. Gestures were familiar, soothing. Ritual of order she'd performed her entire life. But now this wasn't a ritual of fleeing chaos. This was a ritual of preparing for it. She turned her back to the water, looked at the city waking under morning sun. Brooklyn stretched before her, alien and indifferent. Somewhere there was her old life. Apartment in Manhattan, museum laboratory. Colleagues who considered her reliable, predictable, safe Helen. She wouldn't return there. Couldn't. That Helen died in the port warehouse, along with illusions about her mother and Dürer's portrait. Another was born. One capable of destroying a masterpiece for her own survival. One for whom the end justifies any means. True daughter of Victoria Cross. Helen raised her face to the rising sun, closed her eyes, felt its weak warmth on pale skin, and spoke aloud, quietly, to herself. Well, time to start restoration. With a clean canvas. The words dissolved in morning air, carried away by wind from the harbor. Helen opened her eyes, took the first step, then the second, walked along the waterfront, without looking back. Behind her remained the warehouse with Sebastian's body and the ruined masterpiece. Remained the past, destroyed with the same methodical precision with which solvent destroyed paints. Ahead was a clean canvas, and Helen, for the first time in her life, was ready to write her own story on it. Whatever it might be. Whatever pigments she'd have to use. She walked along the deserted waterfront barefoot, with dirty hands, in clothes reeking of rust and chemicals. She walked toward a new life, with a clean canvas.